Abraham Lincoln was 56 years old and had 17 days left to live when this photograph was taken. What's behind him in this image would remain hidden for over a century and a half. This 1865 portrait sat mislabeled in a Pennsylvania University archive for 63 years. When a graduate researcher applied modern enhancement algorithms to the background, what emerged on that wall behind Lincoln stopped her cold. By minute 4, you'll see exactly what's written on that map behind Lincoln, annotations in his own hand that historians have never seen. By minute 12, you'll understand why this photograph was deliberately cropped and buried for over a century. And by minute 22, you'll hear from descendants of the people whose futures hung on what Lincoln was planning in this room, a future that was stolen from them weeks after this image was captured. What you're about to discover is evidence that the Lincoln we think we know, the lenient president of reconciliation, may have been preparing something far more revolutionary. A vision of black citizenship, black land ownership, and black political power that powerful forces made sure would never survive him. Let me show you exactly what's on that wall. The sepia-toned image shows a single figure, Abraham Lincoln, seated at his working desk in the White House. This isn't a formal portrait commissioned for posterity. This is a president caught mid-thought, surrounded by the infrastructure of command. His coat hangs loose from his shoulders. His collar is undone. The famous beard is slightly unkempt, and his eyes, those deep-set, hollow eyes, carry the exhaustion of 600,000 dead Americans. Papers scatter across the desk before him. A half-finished letter, a telegraph dispatch, the remnants of decisions that shaped a nation's fate. Behind him, the White House office crowds with maps, military correspondence, dispatch boxes, the controlled chaos of a war finally ending. And there, on the wall directly behind his left shoulder, a large map of the American South. For over a century, no one looked closely at that map. They should have. For decades, this map was dismissed as a standard military chart, the kind that hung in every War Department office during the Civil War. Troop positions, supply lines, battle formations. But when the researcher enhanced the image, adjusting contrast and resolution pixel by pixel, something unexpected emerged. The pins on that map weren't marking battlefields. They were marking southern cities, county seats, plantation regions across the coastal Carolinas, Georgia, and Florida. And scattered across the map's surface, in handwriting that matched authenticated Lincoln documents, scrawled annotations that no one had ever been able to read. Until now, the first legible notation read, Voter Registration Freedmen, Priority Coastal SC GA FL. Another written in the same distinctive hand. Land redistribution, 400,000 acres minimum, confiscated rebel estates. A third circled twice for emphasis. Franchise cannot wait, must proceed readmission. Abraham Lincoln wasn't just winning a war. He was designing what came next. And what came next was far more radical than anything history has credited him with. Voter registration for formerly enslaved people. Land redistribution from Confederate estates. Voting rights as a condition for Southern states to rejoin the Union. This wasn't the lenient Lincoln of reconciliation. This was a president preparing for revolution. But the annotations weren't the only hidden message. The researcher carefully examined the glass plate itself. On the back, written in a secretary's hand, a notation that had survived 154 years. Office sitting, April 9, with FD not for release. April 9, 1865, the day Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox, the day the Civil War effectively ended. And on that day, Lincoln was photographed with his Reconstruction map, and someone with the initials FD. Who was in the room, and why was this photograph never released? The researcher began where any Lincoln scholar would, the Lincoln Papers at the Library of Congress, over 40,000 documents spanning his presidency. Letters, drafts, memoranda, correspondence with cabinet members and generals. But April 1865 was a black hole. In the chaos following Lincoln's assassination, documents from his final weeks were scattered across multiple agencies. Some were seized by investigators hunting Booth's conspirators. Others were sealed by the War Department. Many simply vanished. Finding who FD was and why they were in that room would require looking elsewhere. The War Department kept its own visitor log during wartime, a security precaution for the executive mansion. These ledgers, now held at the National Archives, recorded every official visitor to Lincoln's office. The researcher requested the volume covering April 1865. And on April 9, 1865, the entry was clear. Mr. Fred Douglass arrived 2:40 in the afternoon, departed 4:15. Frederick Douglass in the White House, with Lincoln for an hour and a half. On the very day the war ended. Frederick Douglass wrote extensively about his encounters with Lincoln. Their 1863 meeting, where Douglass lobbied for equal pay for black soldiers. Their 1864 conversation, where Lincoln discussed colonization and recruitment. Both meetings made headlines. Both appear in Douglass's autobiography. But in that same autobiography, published in 1881, Douglass wrote clearly, "I did not see the president again after August 1864. That's a lie, or a very deliberate omission. Frederick Douglass was in the White House on April 9th. The War Department ledger proves it, and yet he never spoke of it publicly for the rest of his life. What happened in that room that Douglass felt he could not reveal? On April 11th, 2 days after that photograph was taken, Lincoln gave a speech from the White House balcony. A crowd had gathered to celebrate the Confederacy's collapse, and for the first time in his presidency, Lincoln publicly endorsed voting rights for black Americans. John Wilkes Booth was in that crowd. In his diary recovered after his death, Booth wrote, "That means citizenship. Now, by God, I'll put him through." Lincoln had shown his hand, and the assassin had made his decision. 3 days later, Lincoln would be dead. So here's what we know. Lincoln met secretly with Frederick Douglass on the day the war ended. He was photographed with a map showing plans for black voting rights and land redistribution. 2 days later, he publicly endorsed black suffrage, and John Wilkes Booth decided to kill him. But the photograph was never released. The meeting was never acknowledged. And after Lincoln died, those map annotations would vanish from the historical record. The question is, who made them disappear and why? To understand why this photograph was suppressed, you need to understand who stood to lose if Lincoln's plan succeeded. Andrew Johnson was Lincoln's vice president, a political compromise chosen to appeal to border state Democrats. A Tennessee Democrat who opposed secession but remained loyal to the Union. On paper, a symbol of reconciliation. In reality, something very different. Johnson made his views on black Americans explicit. "This is a country for white men, and by God, as long as I am president, it shall be a government for white men." Those are his words, documented, unambiguous. Lincoln's map showed a vision of black citizenship. Johnson would spend his presidency destroying it. Within 60 days of Lincoln's death, Johnson had begun the dismantling. An executive order in May 1865 reversed Sherman's Field Orders No. 15, the famous order that had promised 40 acres to freed slaves along the Georgia and Carolina coasts. 400,000 acres already distributed to black families were taken back. Thousands of freed people who had begun planting crops, building homes, establishing communities on their own land, evicted. The very policy written on Lincoln's map was being erased by Lincoln's successor within weeks of his death. Stay with me, because by minute 12, you're going to see exactly why this photograph was buried. You're going to read the correspondence that proves powerful people knew what was on that wall and made sure America never saw it. In April 1865, 4 million black Americans had just become free. But freedom was not yet citizenship. It wasn't the right to vote. It wasn't the right to own property. It wasn't the right to testify in court against a white person. That future was still being decided in rooms like the one in this photograph. Lincoln's map showed one possible future: black suffrage, land ownership, political power. A transformed South built on the labor of free people who now own their own land. His assassin and his successor would ensure a different future: sharecropping, disenfranchisement, and a century of Jim Crow. The photograph on Lincoln's wall documented the path not taken. For generations, historians told a story: Lincoln was lenient. The radical Republicans were extreme. Lincoln wanted reconciliation, the radicals wanted revolution. This photograph challenges that narrative. Lincoln's map annotations align almost exactly with legislation proposed by radical Republicans. Thaddeus Stevens, Charles Sumner, men portrayed as more extreme than Lincoln. Lincoln wasn't the moderate holding back the radicals. He may have been preparing to lead them. The photograph didn't disappear by accident. A War Department memorandum from late April 1865 orders that all informal photographs from the executive residence be held for official review and not released. This image was held, it was never released. By the time it resurfaced in a 1962 archive transfer, no one remembered what it showed. It was cataloged as unidentified White House interior and forgotten for 60 more years. To understand what Lincoln was planning, the researcher turned to Douglass's private correspondence. Not his public speeches, but his letters to fellow abolitionists. The communications he trusted would remain private. In the Gerrit Smith papers at Syracuse University, she found a letter dated April 12, 1865. 3 days after the photograph, 3 days before the assassination. Douglass wrote carefully, never naming Lincoln directly, a security precaution during wartime. I was summoned to the highest office in the land on the very day of our great victory. I was shown a map of the future, not the map of the war, but of the peace to come. I was asked my views on the readmission of rebel states and the question of the franchise for our people. And then this, I was asked to remain while the photographer completed his work. Frederick Douglass was in the room when that photograph was taken, in April 1865. With this knowledge, the researcher returned to the photograph with different eyes. To the right of the map, there's a framed picture hanging on the wall, glass-covered, reflective. In the glass of that frame, there's a faint mark, previously dismissed as a development flaw in the original plate. A smudge, an artifact. When enhanced using modern imaging technology, it shows something else entirely. The reflection of a figure standing to the camera's left. Near the window, a black man in formal dress. The researcher compared the silhouette to authenticated photographs of Frederick Douglass from the same period. The height, the distinctive profile, the formal posture. For 160 years, Frederick Douglass has been in this photograph. And no one knew he was there. Why hide Douglass, even in a photograph never meant for release? Lincoln's cabinet was divided. Secretary of War Stanton supported radical Reconstruction. Secretary of State Seward counseled caution. Having Frederick Douglass visibly in the White House, consulting on policy at the highest level, would have been explosive. The reflection may have been an accident, Douglass stepping into frame unknowingly. Or it may have been a compromise, a way to document the meeting without making it public. A black man helping shape the future of the nation, hidden in plain sight. 2 days after this photograph, Lincoln gave the speech that killed him. From the White House balcony, he spoke words that would cost him his life. It is unsatisfactory to some that the elective franchise is not given to the colored man. I would myself prefer that it were now conferred. For the first time publicly, Lincoln endorsed black voting rights, the very policy mapped out on his wall. Congressional records show radical Republicans drafting legislation to make it law. Lincoln had 17 days to sign it. He got 3. Lincoln had a plan. Douglass was in the room when he discussed it. The map on his wall showed black suffrage, land redistribution, citizenship. And in 3 days, he would be dead. and the photograph that documented all of this would disappear for a century and a half. But here's what historians are still uncovering. What happened to the specific proposals on that map? Did any of them survive? And what does their failure tell us about the country we became? April 14, 1865, 10:15 at night, Ford's Theater. John Wilkes Booth fired a single bullet into the back of Abraham Lincoln's head. By 7:22 the next morning, Abraham Lincoln was dead. Stanton took control. The War Department locked down. Documents were secured or seized. Investigations launched. And somewhere in that chaos, the photograph on the wall of Lincoln's office began its long disappearance. The researcher traced the map itself. War Department cataloging records from May 1865 show the map was removed, pins cataloged, and base document filed separately. The annotations, Lincoln's handwriting, were not preserved as a separate record. They were transcribed for the record, but no transcription has been found in any archive. The physical evidence of Lincoln's Reconstruction vision was taken apart, piece by piece, deliberately dismembered. The dismantling was systematic. May 1865, Johnson issues mass pardons to Confederate officers. June, he orders the restoration of confiscated lands to former slaveholders. July, he rejects the Freedmen's Bureau's authority to protect black voting. By the end of the year, Lincoln's map had become a ghost. The policies written on it were not just unfulfilled, they were actively destroyed. If you're still watching, you understand what was lost. Not just a president, but a vision of what America could have been. But what you don't know yet is what happened when the descendants of the people on that map, the freed people whose future Lincoln was designing, discovered that this photograph existed. That's coming in the next few minutes. The radicals didn't surrender. Thaddeus Stevens, Charles Sumner, they fought Johnson at every step, using every tool Congress possessed. The 14th Amendment, citizenship for the formerly enslaved. The 15th, the right to vote. They even impeached Johnson, missing conviction by a single vote. But the full vision on Lincoln's map, land redistribution, immediate enfranchisement, economic independence, never became law. America got a compromise, not the transformation. 1877, the compromise. After a disputed presidential election, Republicans agreed to withdraw federal troops from the South in exchange for the White House. Reconstruction ended, not with a battle but with a bargain. Within a decade, every Southern state had passed laws to strip black men of the vote. Poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, violence. The future Lincoln, mapped on his wall, didn't just fail to happen. It was made illegal to pursue. For a century, the photograph simply didn't exist in the historical record. War Department sealed files until 1922. National Archives transfer in 1948. University donation in 1962. Labeled Unidentified Interior, Probable Government Office, circa 1860s. No Lincoln, no Douglass, no map. Just a dusty glass plate in a box that no one opened for 60 years. In 2019, a graduate student at the university was testing facial recognition algorithms on Civil War-era photographs. A digital humanities project, scanning thousands of unidentified images. Her program flagged an image in an unidentified folder. Possible match: Abraham Lincoln, confidence 87%. She pulled the glass plate from storage. She ran the enhancements. And what had been invisible for 154 years began to appear. The handwriting analysis took 3 months. Lincoln scholars from 3 universities examined the enhanced annotations, comparing them to authenticated Lincoln documents, letters, speeches, executive orders. The verdict was unanimous. The handwriting was consistent with authenticated Lincoln documents. The photographic plate, chemically dated to 1860 to 1866. The White House interior, matched to known 1865 layouts. This photograph is real, and it had been hidden for over a century. This photograph doesn't just add to Lincoln's scholarship, it challenges it. For generations, historians portrayed Lincoln as the moderate, hesitant on black rights, focused on reconciliation with the South. The radical Republicans were the extremists. Lincoln was the voice of reason. This image shows something different. A president actively planning black suffrage, land redistribution, political power. The question historians are now asking, if this was Lincoln's vision, why did the official history say otherwise? And who benefited from that distortion? Frederick Douglass never publicly acknowledged the April 9th meeting. But in 1888, at a commemoration of Lincoln's birthday, he said something that has puzzled scholars for over a century. What Lincoln might have become, we were not permitted to see. What he was becoming, few of us knew. For 130 years, those words were read as elegy, a great man cut down before his time. Now they read as testimony. Douglass knew what Lincoln was planning. He watched it die with him. And he carried that knowledge in silence for the rest of his life. Lincoln had a plan, Douglass was his witness, the photograph was their proof. And for over a century, all of it was hidden. The image misfiled, the meeting unacknowledged, the vision erased. But this photograph's rediscovery didn't just matter to historians. It mattered to the descendants of the 4 million people whose futures Lincoln was mapping on that wall. What did they think when they finally saw it? Andrew Johnson's presidency ended in disgrace. Impeached by the House, abandoned by his own party, remembered by history as one of America's worst presidents, a man who squandered the opportunity of a generation. But here's the bitter truth, his sabotage worked. The amendments passed, but their enforcement was gutted. The rights Lincoln mapped on his wall wouldn't be realized for another century. Johnson lost the battle, but he won the war. For over a century, the lenient Lincoln narrative served a purpose. If Lincoln wouldn't have pushed for black rights, if he preferred reconciliation over revolution, then his successors can't be blamed for abandoning Reconstruction. They were just following Lincoln's wishes. This photograph exposes that story as what it was, a convenient fiction. Lincoln wasn't preparing leniency, he was preparing revolution. And every president who claimed Lincoln's legacy, while opposing black rights, was betraying the man on this wall. The photograph has now been scanned in full resolution and published. Major Lincoln biographers have issued revised assessments. Academic conferences have convened. Textbooks are being rewritten. Eric Foner, the leading historian of Reconstruction, called it a visual document that forces us to reimagine Lincoln's final vision. What was hidden is now visible. What was suppressed is now evidence. The record has been corrected. They succeeded in the short term. Reconstruction was sabotaged. A century of oppression followed. But they didn't destroy the evidence. The photograph survived. Misfiled, yes, forgotten, yes, but not destroyed. 154 years later, it told its story anyway. The truth was just waiting for technology capable of revealing it and someone willing to look. The researcher contacted the descendants of coastal Georgia freedpeople, an organization tracing families who received land under Sherman's field orders. Families who held deeds in 1865, who planted crops on their own land, who built homes they expected to pass to their children. Families whose land was taken back by Andrew Johnson's orders, sometimes at gunpoint. They agreed to see the photograph. The families brought their own records. Land deeds from 1865, signed, stamped, legal. Bills of sale from 1866, when the land was taken back and sold to former Confederate owners. Letters from ancestors describing the soldiers who came to evict them, the crops left in the fields, the homes they'd built with their own hands. And photographs, tintypes from 1866 showing their ancestors on land they owned for a few months before it was stolen. Dorothy Me Simmons is 84 years old. Her great-great-grandmother was born enslaved in Liberty County, Georgia. Her great-great-grandfather held a deed to 40 acres in 1865, land he worked, land he intended to leave to his children. When she saw Lincoln's map, the enhanced annotations about land redistribution, voter registration, the franchise for freed people, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "So he knew. Lincoln knew what they were going to do to us, and he was trying to stop it." She paused. "And they killed him for it." Dorothy Mee's great-granddaughter, Aaliyah, is 16. She has the high-resolution image on her phone, downloaded from the University Archive's public database. She's looking at the same map annotations, zooming in with her fingers the way her ancestors never could. "I'm going to show my history teacher," she says. "They teach us Lincoln freed the slaves. They don't teach us what he was going to do next." She looks at the photograph one more time. "Now we have the picture. Look at the photograph one more time." Abraham Lincoln, exhausted with 17 days left to live, his coat rumpled, his eyes carrying the weight of 600,000 dead, a half-finished letter on his desk. Behind him, a map of the future, his handwriting on the wall, planning black suffrage, land redistribution, citizenship. A vision of America that powerful men would ensure never came to be. And in the reflection, barely visible, Frederick Douglass, watching, knowing, the only witness to what Lincoln intended. Two men in a room, planning a country that never came to be. History is not what happened. History is what survived and who decided to save it. This photograph was hidden because it showed a story someone didn't want told. Lincoln as radical, Douglass as advisor, Reconstruction as revolution. For 150 years, that story was suppressed. It wasn't lost, it was waiting. Waiting for the technology to read it, the researchers to find it, the descendants to claim it. Truth surfaces, it just takes time. In 1865, Abraham Lincoln sat for a portrait he didn't know would be hidden. Behind him, a map of a country that never existed, but almost did. Beside him, invisible but present, the man who should have helped him build it. For 154 years, this photograph kept its secrets. It's not hidden anymore. If this story resonated with you, there are hundreds more like it. Photographs in archives around the world, waiting for someone to look closely. In my next video, we're examining an 1892 portrait from Mississippi that historians dismissed for decades. What they found in the background changes everything we thought we knew about post-Reconstruction survival. Subscribe so you don't miss it. And if your family has stories, old photographs, documents, memories passed down, those stories matter. They might be the missing evidence for someone else's search. Drop a comment or reach out. Let's keep finding what was hidden.